Bangalore's surviving lakes are not places with pristine water. Things can be quite messy. There's sewage that comes in, there's treated water that comes in, there are various nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, which determine the chemistry and in turn the biology of these lakes. If we want to rejuvenate our lakes, if we want to have thriving blue and green spaces for a city like Bangalore, we really need to understand lake chemistry and lake biology. Let's begin and make an attempt on that with Dr. Veena Srinivasan.
Welcome to the Well Lab show, where we try to learn more about water, environment, land, and livelihoods. I'm Pavan Srinath. Every 2 weeks, we'll sit with some of our colleagues at Well Labs or talk to some of our wonderful partners and learn more about the science, the systems, and the stories around complex environmental and social issues. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the Well Lab show. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Today, we are talking about the science of lakes. We spoke before about the physics and the hydrology of lakes, and today we'll be talking a little more about the chemistry and a little bit about the biology of Bangalore's lakes. Returning to the Well Lab show, joining me again is Dr. Veena Srinivasan, the founder and executive director of Well Labs. Veena, welcome back.
Thank you.
So, Veena, last we have an entire episode where you spoke about sort of the deep history of Bangalore's lakes, right? How these are not natural lakes formed by glaciers or other things, but made by human beings at various times. But, streams and channels carved out by millions and billions of years of geological time with rainfall and other things happening, and how the lakes and this system evolved after Bangalore became Bangalore, right? After we had urbanization, after we had various threats and also new things happening around the lakes, and what happened to the physical sort of shape, the interconnectedness, the water retention, recharge, all of that of lakes. Often, I think when we talk about lakes, the lake hydrology and the physics get studied a lot more, talked about a lot more. But I think especially in our urban context, it's the lake chemistry and biology which perhaps matter even more now, right? Because you have not just water, but all kinds of things entering the lake. And then what can the lake manage on its own? What do we need to prevent from source? There's an entire conversation on that. And while it's important that we have good conversations on how do you actually rejuvenate a lake, I'm hoping that today we spend time on the science of it, right? Understanding what happens so that then we get a sense of, okay, therefore what we can do. So let me start off, right? Bangalore is not yet Bangalore. You have these lakes, but in a more rural setting. What would the lake chemistry and biology be like? What would be happening in these lakes?
Sure. So I think the main thing to remember is these were rainwater harvesting structures. And so originally the lakes were pretty much getting rainwater. And in occasional some places they might have been getting spring water, which is water from the bottom of the lake where your groundwater table it's a groundwater discharge zone, and then the groundwater is seeping into the lake. But for most part, they were basically getting fresh water. And in pre-urban times, particularly if you look at anywhere from 14th to 18th century, there wasn't a lot of like pesticide or fertilizer application as such. So really the lakes were relatively free from pollution. They were full of fresh water and a little bit of maybe pollution from the catchment might have been some agricultural waste or some animal waste. But for most part, that was relatively low density compared to the size of lakes and compared to all of the other flows that were coming into the lake. So they were clean, relatively low in any kind of nutrients, which we might, talk about today, which is really phosphates, nitrates, carbon. Those are kind of the three things, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus that you're really talking about. But those would have been very low. And it's really just clean water.
Along with maybe, if anything, silt and like particulate matter, some dissolved salts that we've talked about, I think, in our previous episodes, right?
Of course.
When you have flowing water which stops in a lake,
yes,
whatever particles will settle down.
Yeah.
But that was
the key thing is they're not biological in origin. Right. Those are, geological in origin, where they're caused by weathering of rock and weathering of soils and soil erosion. So if you really think about what gets brought into the lake, the big particles kind of get stuck in places where the water has very high energy, but in the lake, really it's still water, and then the smallest particles settle down And those would be desilted every year when the lake dried up, taken back to the fields. And so that was the cycle. But those were primarily inorganic in origin.
So what starts happening as Bangalore starts becoming Bangalore? This is like maybe late 17th century, 18th, and then 19th and 20th.
I think the main thing is as settlements started developing close to the lakes or the tanks, whatever you want to call them, we're using them interchangeably, right? You started getting all kinds of human waste streams coming into the lake. And initially, it was primarily, some washing at the lake. It would have been some animals being brought to graze at the lake. And then eventually, as densities of population increased, you started seeing sewage flows into the lakes. But remember, in pre-colonial times, these were relatively small populations. They were relatively small amounts of water that were being used. We're not talking about like detergent and washing machines or any of that. And therefore, they were still negligible compared to all other sources of water entering the lake. And so they were not significant. But they begin as soon as human populations close to lakes increased. And then, of course, with urbanization, the main thing is you're talking about much, much higher densities of population. And initially, the water is manageable with local septic tanks. The quantums are so low that they don't go all the way to the local lake. They kind of get deposited in some smaller local pond somewhere. But as your densities of population increase, you're starting to see all of that grey water and black water even starting getting into the channels, the main Rajakaluways, and then entering the lake. And then you start really seeing a lot of these lakes start getting raw sewage into them. And then the real problem of like urban lake pollution starts.
And I think we had an entire conversation with our colleague Deepthi Nagappa on like what happens when we flush our toilet, when water exits our bathrooms and our toilets, and what all is there in them. And this idea that yes, when we like poop, when we wash and bathe, and all those waste go out, you have, like you said, the carbon that comes from everything that we consume and then let out. But also there's nitrogen, which is more obvious because there's ammonia in urine and other sources. But also importantly, phosphorus, right? And a big part of human body is phosphorus, and those three things are the nutrients that come into the lake.
Exactly.
So in a more modern setting, when you don't have all your sewage being treated and therefore none of it sort of entering lakes, whereas a lot of sewer lines are there overlapping with stormwater drains, and a lot of it, treatment is far from 100%. And so you have all of these sort of this wastewater entering our lakes. What happens to the lake system?
You're talking about large amounts of wastewater, right? So Bengaluru, at its peak before the sewage treatment plants came in, had 600 million liters of sewage, raw sewage entering.
Wow.
I mean, they were just massive, massive amounts of sewage. So the first thing is that for us to understand a little bit of the chemistry, both carbon and nitrogen exist in gaseous form. So, if you look at what our atmosphere is composed of, we have oxygen, we have nitrogen, which is the bulk of the gaseous composition of the atmosphere, which is, almost 80%, oxygen, which is about 20%, and then carbon dioxide, which is, a tiny amount. And of course, we all understand that climate change is caused by that small percentage of carbon dioxide of less than 1% increasing gradually in the global atmosphere. But the point is that because carbon and nitrogen exist in the atmosphere, there are natural biological processes which decompose and release any kind of carbon, whether carbon in the soil or carbon in the water, through bacterial activity back into the atmosphere. And that does not happen with phosphorus, because phosphorus, in fact, does not exist in a gaseous form. And the entire kind of problem of nutrients in lakes comes down to that one fact, that the other things eventually nature will take over and send them back, and you'll achieve some kind of a balance. They get digested, so on. But phosphorus will go into the sediments and it will be there forever. And eventually, it's going to find a way to come back into the water column, and then all of the problems, if you want to call it, of pollution come and arise from that chemistry.
So what you're sort of saying is, if small amounts of carbon, which is organic matter, right, whatever carbon might be sitting in various sort of fatty acid chain, right?
In
A whole
plants,
host of
whatever.
things, starch, whatever. If it's in small amounts, eventually that will go to the air. There'll be some
Eventually,
bacteria,
bacteria, fungi.
some other things will metabolize it, convert it to carbon dioxide, and it'll escape.
Exactly.
And you're saying it's sort of the same with nitrogen too. There's a
Exactly.
little bit of ammonia, uric acid, etc. It'll eventually get digested by something, go out. But the phosphorus cannot go out.
It cannot. I mean, all of this is about the dance between the biology and chemistry, right? So if you have a ton of phosphates hanging around, what's going to happen is there are going to be all of these algal blooms, cyanobacteria, which are able to fix atmospheric nitrogen. So now suddenly they have plenty of everything. These are warm tropical environments. You've got all of that sunshine and oxygen, and you've got phosphorus in the water, and you can fix nitrogen from the air. And so now, even if you don't have any carbon in the water, nitrates in the water, there is a whole bunch of these organisms, like blue-green algae, for example, that are able to pull the nitrogen back from the atmosphere, and then they're able to bloom. Limnologists would say that phosphates are the limiting nutrient. That means they're going to grow until they use up all of the phosphates. They're going to grow as much as the phosphates allow. And what's really happened with these urban sewage streams entering is that phosphates essentially become infinite. And so you can have essentially infinite amounts of these algal blooms, these thick green sludge that you see in lakes, in many lakes around Bangalore. You can have, essentially they can grow as much as they want with no limit, because the only thing that was stopping them was how much phosphorus they could absorb from the water column. So that's what makes the lake from being this nice, clear, water body where fishes are, are swimming, to these thick green sludge soups that you see in the more polluted lakes.
So just go back, you talked about limnology. Limnology is what? The study of...
The study of the biology and chemistry of lakes, essentially, right?
Okay. So how that varies across the depth.
How it varies across the depth, what happens to the different organisms, how do they absorb, what feeds on what's the food web in these freshwater ecosystems, how does that change, all of that.
Dear viewer, if you're liking the Well Lab show so far, you may also like the Water Data podcast with my colleague, Veena Srinivasan. Veena is an award-winning water researcher and thinker and talks to some of the top minds in the world on everything water. You can find all episodes of the Water Data podcast on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.
So what you're saying is, if there is phosphorus coming into the lake via sewage, via something, that alone is enough.
That alone is
because there's nitrogen in the air, there's carbon dioxide in the air. Just the presence of phosphorus is enough.
But there's always going to be enough nitrogen and phosphorus in any sewage stream. But it's the phosphorus which is what's called the limiting nutrient.
So I understand that. So even if there's just phosphorus, even if you've stopped other sources of pollution, just that phosphorus will enable bacteria, not even bacteria, right?
It's algal, blue-green algae, basically.
Blue-green algae, to be able to find the other nutrients and then bloom and then destroy other systems.
And the way they destroy it is essentially, once they've kind of grown and then they start decaying, they start taking up all of the oxygen. And also they cut off sunlight to the bottom of the lake because they're this thick, sludge. And once they start absorbing all of that oxygen, you're going to basically see these massive crashes in oxygen, and therefore the aquatic fish and other species which also need dissolved oxygen can't survive. And then your entire aquatic food chain, so if you don't have fish, then you don't have birds that can feed on the fish, and then basically your entire food web is collapsed.
Right. So maybe we should talk about that food web a little, right? Like if we imagine that no sewage is entering the lake is healthy, getting good water, then it would be supporting its own biology, right?
Exactly.
Its own limnology.
Exactly.
What does that look like?
So in a traditional kind of system, you have the phytoplankton, which are the little plants, microscopic plants, which are able to fix chlorophyll, and I mean they have chlorophyll.
So these are algae and not blue-green algae.
They're plants of a whole range of species that are able to use the sunlight because the water column is clear and it has oxygen in it, and they're able to use the oxygen and the sunlight, and they're able to use their chlorophyll and basically grow. But they don't grow at crazy rates that take over the entire plant. So they have a much more normal life cycle, and that allows the presence of zooplankton, which are the grazers on them. that
And in
are
fact,
able
it's
to.
these phytoplankton which are basically receiving sunlight and then they're taking absorbed carbon dioxide, right?
Exactly.
And in fact, then they're further oxygenating the
And
lake.
they're
That's one of the
oxygenating the
services they
lake at
provide,
normal levels, exactly.
allowing these zooplankton and other, even fish, to survive.
To survive. And you're talking about dissolved oxygen levels in these normal kind of freshwater lakes to be between 6 and 9 milligrams per liter. And you have the zooplankton are grazing on them, the fish are grazing on the zooplankton, the larger fish are grazing on the smaller fish. You have different kinds of native species that are occupying different ecological niches. And then you have various kinds of birds, waders and migratory birds and so on, that are able to feed on the fish. You have amphibians of different types. So you have a range of species occupying different ecological niches that are able to survive in these kinds of environments. And of course, that system kind of stays in some kind of an equilibrium over time. There's no one species that kind of just completely runs away and takes over the entire system.
So there's some equilibrium, and fundamentally these lakes are shallow lakes, right?
They're fundamentally shallow.
Most
lakes.
of the Bangalore and peninsular Indian
Exactly.
lakes are shallow.
You're talking
So
about
we-
like 6 feet to 10, 15 feet, somewhere
and
in
maybe some can go a little bit
there.
deep.
Some can go a little bit.
So it's not like you have large patches of these lakes. This is not like Lake Baikal, which is one of the deepest lakes in the world, where you have a large section of the lake which will never see sunlight.
Correct. Sunlight's going all the way to the bottom in the traditional, yeah.
So when sewage comes in and you have these blue-green algae creating these algal blooms, one of the things that happens is you cut off sunlight. The water goes from transparent or translucent to fairly opaque.
You start seeing these oxygen spikes and crashes. So when you have that much of blue-green algae, in the day, they're actually generating oxygen still.
Okay.
But you'll actually, if you went to measure dissolved oxygen in the middle of the day, you'll find supersaturated levels because they are still, photosynthesizing. But then at night, you kind of see these massive crashes. So when you start looking at those same lakes, and you measure it early in the morning, like at 4 or 5 in the morning, when you've had many hours of basically no photosynthetic activity, you'll suddenly see dissolved oxygens of 2 to 3 milligrams per liter. So 4 is the absolute minimum required for fish to be able to survive and thrive. That's when you go for morning walks, you start seeing the fish, belly up and they're dead early in the morning. And it happens early in the morning because the photosynthetic crash happens early in the morning.
So what you're saying is there's a system of equilibrium. It's not stasis, right?
Yeah.
There's always things in flux and moving, but it's equilibrium. But equilibrium goes to these crazy cycles of almost boom and bust.
Yes.
Right? Something grows like crazy, then dies like crazy, and then the system's just
and
upset.
It's happening within a diurnal cycle. So that's why the fish are basically dying and you have these dead zones.
So there's something that we talk about with lake chemistry, which is there's biological oxygen demand or chemical oxygen demand. What do they stand for typically?
Biological and chemical oxygen demand, it's really a measure of the carbon or the organic load in a lake. So it's basically how much oxygen do you need for the bacterial, microbial activity in the lake to digest all of that carbon. And so basically, because they need to digest the carbon, so carbon plus oxygen is carbon dioxide, they're going to use up oxygen. And so if you have basically a sample with a certain carbon load, and it has a certain oxygen level, and you look at it after 5 days. So typically you talk about BOD5 as being the measure. Then how much of that oxygen has been used up in 5 days is the measure of the organic carbon loading.
So it's a proxy of the nutrients, the carbon that's being loaded.
Particularly organic carbon in particular.
Right.
And then chemical oxygen demand is, there's also chemical, one is biological digestion, but there's also chemical reactions using up, oxygen in the water, and that's the chemical oxygen demand. And that can be a combination of both organic and inorganic needs of oxygen.
Right.
And so you need to use both of these because your sewage may contain purely organic material, but it also contains a bunch of other, we've talked about detergents and other types of things as well. And so that's why you use both of these. But biological oxygen demand is essentially telling you how much organic material there has to be be digested.
Okay. So if I were to, again, I want to keep dialing back and then going back in, right? I'm wondering that even in, I think, pre-urban times, you would have lakes with wetlands associated with them, right? If you have, say, a wet season, you'll have a bunch of plant growth,
Right.
right? And then when it starts drying, a bunch of plants will die, right? There will be many seasonal, from grasses to hyacinths to other things will grow and things will die. And then once they die, they do create a certain amount of organic matter, right? So one of the parts of these sort of lake ecosystems is the presence of wetlands, right? It's not like the lake means there's this sort of
Clear
clean water
freshwater
body,
lake that you can see at the bottom.
with like just mud around it, or grass around it, and then that dries up or reduces, right? You have these wetland systems.
So the important thing is these man-made tanks, people did not necessarily appreciate them for their ecological value. They were like storage structures for irrigation in the dry season. So they did, but they were not like your Ramsar wetlands, which were these, low-lying places where rainwater collected, which were not man-made, which were relatively shallow, and then therefore created these massive breeding grounds for all kinds of biodiversity. So they did happen even in Bangalore lakes, but they were not valued for that purpose.
Right.
That's not
it's today that we found value for that.
Exactly. Nobody's irrigating anything in the middle of the city, and now they're the last green spaces, and birders want to go and see what kind of birds have come to the lake and so on. So now they serve that ecological function. But most of the Bangalore lakes, the way we speak about them, was not their function. So there might have been a little bit of wetlands here and there, but because they were thought about as being storage functions, they were not optimized to serve ecological functions. So they didn't have all those shallow littoral zones where the sunlight reaches the bottom and they're very high productivity and so on. A lot of them had very steep edges. They would be, have what's called a soup bowl kind of thing, not this very shallow zone.
So it's more like a mini reservoir.
They were mini
with
reservoirs,
a mini dam, rather than a natural water body.
Exactly. But in a traditional wetland, which was just basically a low-lying area, which was marshy, which collected rainwater, or sometimes there were groundwater discharge zones in some places. In those places, what you said, definitely applied, where there are lots of plants and lots of trees, and they were certainly not these clear bowls of water.
So if we then look at it, today there's a lot of sewage entering almost all our lakes, or like one of the things that you mentioned in our lake hydrology episode is to prevent sewage from coming in because sewage is contaminating the stormwater. We've erected these walls, right? Which are sort of these tents, as you describe them, where regular flows, they just divert and bypass the lake. But when you get a lot of rainfall, there's higher water, so that diluted sewage at least enters the lake.
Right.
So if a little bit of sewage enters the lake, diluted sewage, can the lake just manage it on its own?
Remember that phosphate is the limiting nutrient. So I'll only talk about phosphate for a second. If you talk about secondary treated sewage from a plant, you're talking about phosphate numbers like 2 to 8 milligrams per liter. Our raw sewage would be much, much higher than that, right? Maybe, 30 to or higher. So now we talk about secondary treated, like I said, 2 to 8 milligrams per liter. If you've really, scrubbed the nutrients out of the secondary sewage, you're talking about 0.1 to 2 milligrams per liter. 0.1 is where your phosphate limit is for the lake not go eutrophic, which is not to have that entire cascade of things that we talked about. So when we are talking about even small amounts of raw sewage, again, it depends on the ratio of the sewage to the rainwater. That's what it comes down to. But even relatively small amounts of raw sewage in a rainwater stream or continuous secondary treated sewage is already a loading of 5 to 10 times what it should be.
Okay.
Now, some amount of that you can take away with constructed wetlands and so on, where you've put plants around and they're able to absorb some of those
I'll talk about
nutrients.
that a little more. But a lake without other interventions, even a little bit of sewage coming in, if the phosphorus is beyond a very minimum level, is enough to upset the lake. Right? That's the main takeaway. And so you need some systems to prevent this in any sort.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about then what do we actually do, right? Like, so clearly the takeaway is you cannot have sewage coming into the lake or even treated water coming into the lake if it contains enough phosphorus, right? The lakes cannot thrive in that environment. So then how all can we start making this? Because the lakes were built for a certain function. That function's gone away. Today's Bangalore lakes serve different function, right? They serve an ecological function. They're a hub of nature and biodiversity, and they perform key hydrological functions, right? They can
Flood control,
flood
recharge.
control, groundwater recharge, etc. So what do we need to do? How can we come in?
So let's
Is it that
first
we set up a sewage treatment plant above every lake, treat all the water, only let treated water come through?
Yeah.
Even there you said you have to capture the phosphorus before the treated water
correct.
comes.
Look at the worst case. What happens in the very, very end when these lakes kind of are dying, right? So initially you get blue-green algae. The blue-green algae kind of eventually kind of create these dense materials because they're taking back carbon dioxide and nitrogen from the air. They're building these thick mats of blue-green algae. They die, they go to the bottom of the lake. This keeps happening. Eventually the lake bed itself is coming up. And so we talked briefly about mixing. So when the lake is kind of somewhat deep, you still have a lot of turbulence in the lake. But once it becomes very shallow, what you start seeing is you start seeing water hyacinth starting to take over. So water hyacinths thrive in nitrogen-rich waters. Water hyacinths, though, it starts becoming still because you don't have the same kind of turbulent mixing. And now the water hyacinth kind of starts taking over and becoming a complete thick mat. And then there's no sunlight getting past that at all.
Right.
And that's kind of almost the terminal state of a very shallow lake, which is very still, and it's been taken over completely at the surface and nothing's growing below. So now, when we talked about the nutrients, we said basically there's phosphates and there's nitrates. Where do the phosphates come from? They come not only from our own poop, but they're also coming from detergents and dishwashing soap and so
Correct.
on. Here is where there's a big difference between India and the US and Europe, right? Because in India, almost 65% of the contribution of the phosphates can be from detergents. But in Europe and the US, where they have much, much more stringent standards, in fact, it's almost 1/10 the allowance, if I remember correctly, only 10% of the contribution is typically from detergents. And actually, the bulk of the phosphates that into the Great Lakes and so on are actually from agricultural sources. So the biggest thing you do first is to not have as many phosphates in water. And I haven't completely understood why, as we've developed, we haven't gotten more stringent, because clearly it's possible. The rest of the world does it. There are plenty of kind of eco-friendly brands even in India.
And I think you do have non-phosphate
You do
detergents
have
available today.
They are available in the market, but they're not mandated. The big multi-national brands still have very high phosphate levels. I assume there's a price differential in between the phosphate and the phosphate-free detergents.
So you're sort of saying the prevention is better than cure idea goes all the way upstream.
Exactly.
Forget whatever leaves the homes itself, cut the phosphorus there.
Right. Almost more than half, of the phosphates finally ending up in an urban lake can be cut right at the source if you had stringent regulations. Then, of course, the next thing is the sewage treatment plant. And here you've got to do not just secondary treatment, which is digesting all of the carbon, but you've got to do tertiary treatment and actually removing and precipitating the phosphate right into the sludge. Then we have the last bit of phosphorus after all of the phosphorus has been scrubbed by the sewage treatment plant. Then you can do a constructed wetland. People have done all kinds of things saying, can you grow medicinal plants in the constructed wetland? Can you grow other types of things which can be harvested and used in a constructed wetland?
Tell me what a constructed wetland.
So constructed wetland is just basically a space where you're putting a matrix which has a lot of biological activity and a bunch of plants which will actually literally take up that excess phosphates.
So before the water hits the lake, you create a smaller section.
Yes.
Where the water comes first.
Yes.
And flows through these plants. And
it flows through these plants
by
or a
matrix,
matrix.
you mean what?
I mean, the matrix, some of them, if use a specific kind of substrate, which encourages biological activity of different types, so that it's not just the plant, but it's also
So you want like a large amount of surface area which different types of bacteria and other microorganisms can cling to and grow.
And also absorb some of that.
And
phosphate.
This is the interesting thing, both with the sludge you mentioned in the lake. In Deepti's episode, we talked about sludge in sewage treatment plants. The idea that these are not bacteria like they grow on a petri dish, right?
Right.
These are bacteria and other things that grow in bulk volume.
Yes.
And they have like physical mass and weight at a large level.
Yes.
And they perform a function.
Yes.
Right? So you're
And
saying
sometimes the bacteria take up much more of the phosphates than the plants themselves.
right.
Yeah.
And so together the idea is rather than having these uncontrolled blooms and other things happen in the lake, you do them in a controlled manner in the wetland.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And then
of
grab
course, you've
the
got to
resource.
harvest the plants and use them for
Okay,
grazing.
so
and
the
do the rest.
necessary part of constructed wetlands is you use them, have them grow, and you sort of harvest them in
Yeah.
some way.
It's like you're literally growing
So
a
you have to
crop.
physically remove the nutrients from the system.
Exactly.
Okay.
Hopefully, at that point, you've reached that 0.1 milligram per liter, that much lower level. And at that point, the biological removal kicks in, because then you're having normal levels of phytoplankton and then zooplankton, and then you have fish, and you can actually seed fish, certain types of fish, to kind of accelerate some of that.
Liking the episode so far? Hit the subscribe button on YouTube and check out more episodes of the Well Lab show. And hey, share this episode with a friend, a colleague, a student, or a fellow environmental enthusiast who might find this episode useful. We hope to reach more great people like you.
So, Veena, these constructed wetlands are therefore one solution to manage that residual amount of nutrients that come into the water.
And then, like I said, the last bit, the lake can take, in the normal way that they are able to, through the food web, you have phytoplankton and zooplankton and small fish and large fish. And you can do a little bit of manipulation of accelerating that food chain. And therefore, ultimately, the phosphorus is literally being removed by fishing. At that point, you're talking about relatively small amounts.
What about other solutions? There are a whole host of solutions that come in when it comes to lakes, right? There are people have talked about floating wetlands, constructed wetlands. I understand you take a chunk of the lake. How do these floating wetlands work? You again create this matrix, but in a floating setup.
So you're doing the same thing in a floating setup. I think that a lot of those, they're just undersized. If you think about one of those little things you've seen floating is 1 square meter. And if you put 100 of them, and I've never seen people putting 100 of them, then you're talking about 100 square meters, which is 100th of a hectare. And a lot of these lakes are anywhere from, 10 to 50 hectares, the types of lakes that we're talking about. But nonetheless, 100th of a hectare, and that's after you put 100 of those squares in the lakes, are not going to cover and do very much.
And even those floating ones, you have to treat them the same way, right? In the matrix, in the plants, things grow, then you sort of
you've got to maintain them over
so
time.
there's that operations and maintenance thing has to be a thing.
Exactly.
So even the constructed wetlands, you have to build them as a sizable proportion of the actual lake area. Correct. Right? They can't be sort of namesake small little things that you do.
So the one place that I've seen people kind of do things is they're actually growing stuff almost as a crop. And then O&M pays for itself, right? Because somebody is benefiting from harvesting whatever the particular type. We haven't done that much in Bangalore, where there's a significant enough income stream coming from it. But that's a place you can imagine that the O&M would actually take care of itself.
Right. And there are talks of bioenzymes and other things. What role do these things play?
I don't understand how any of those address the fundamental problem of the phosphates in the lake. So temporarily, you're going to see an acceleration of some of just the digestion of the carbon happening. But at the end of it, phosphate doesn't have a gaseous form. You have to have a law of conservation of mass, right? Elements can't be destroyed or created easily. There's no nuclear reactions happening, which means your phosphorus is still going to be hanging around in that system and eventually going to sit in the sediment. Now, sometimes it can stay kind of attached to the sediment. There are kind of things you can do to kind of keep the phosphorus like locked in. But the vast majority of the bioenzyme solutions that I know of are not doing anything like that. And so temporarily it looks great. You chuck these things, everything clears up because there was all this extra sludge. It all got digested by different types of bacteria. But if you do nothing after that, everything else is going to settle. I mean, the phosphates are going to be at the bottom. And then over time, they're going to remobilize. There's going to be a bunch of, algae that are saying, well, there's all this phosphate in the sediment and there's, nitrogen in the air, and we can kind of make hay again. That cycle of the lake being back to where it is going to happen.
So when it comes to solving these, one, we need to make sure that things like constructed wetlands or floating wetlands need to be sized right.
Yeah.
Right? It's the equivalent of saying, I have a fever or a headache. Instead of taking whatever 500 milligrams of paracetamol, I'm taking 2 milligrams or 10 milligrams. It's not going to make a difference, right? Even if it's in theory be an effective solution,
right,
they need to be at the right size and the right concentration or whatever.
Right.
The second thing you're saying is you have a lot of things which will be like temporary fixes, but don't treat the underlying condition.
Exactly.
So if we were to look at this holistically, say you have a polluted lake, take any in the city, right? Like most cities might be in this. And there's this lake rejuvenation exercise that happened. And I want to talk about lake rejuvenation on an entirely different episode. But say people have recognized, there's sludge and there is silt, and the silt might also have phosphorus. We will desilt the whole thing, desludge the whole lake.
Right.
And then you're allowing the lake to function again.
Right.
What all do you need to do to make sure that this lake can now flourish, have good chemistry, good biology?
So if you actually removed all of the legacy phosphorus from the sediment, then you're literally hitting a reset button and starting from scratch. Then you at least need to make sure that you don't have raw sewage going back into the lake, right? So you've got to cut the new phosphorus entering the lake back to that very acceptable and low 0.1 milligram per liter or
which
something
currently is
it's
impossible
unachievable
in Bangalore?
Yeah, unachievable. Okay.
So even if there's a sewage treatment plant at the head of the lake, we are not positioned to get that.
I mean, our sewage treatment plants all don't function as they should. And they're certainly not scrubbing nutrients at the level that would prevent eutrophication for most part. But nonetheless, we are all sort of managing. I mean, there is Jakur, it has a sewage treatment plant, it goes through a constructed wetland, it scrubs some of the nutrients. The lake is still eutrophic by standards of phosphates being in the water, but every now and then you get a heavy rain. The heavy rain kind of washes the entire water column out, and then it takes a while for all of the phosphorus in the sediments to resuspend. So you keep having injections of reasonable quality rainwater, and that sort of keeps the lake alive in some way.
Okay. So can see some lakes which are like at least half healthy.
Exactly.
Which can sort of stumble and function.
Yeah.
But we need to do a lot of things systemically if we really want really, really healthy lakes to survive around us.
Right.
Tell us a little about the other aspects of a lake. So if we want to engineer a lake for having good biodiversity and so on, right? If the primary purpose is not this water quality management issue, how should we look at the kinds of interventions? One of the things that we touched upon in the previous episode too was this idea of lake sort of design, right? You design it as this big soup bowl or a tank. If you have shallow zones, what does it do?
You have reed, birds which nest in the reed beds and so on. And so you have more of the water birds need places to nest. And so that you're going to get a category of species that you wouldn't get in the more soup bowl type of things.
The other, outside of having these shallow zones, people have built these bird islands. But these bird islands have their own challenges, right? How should we think about a bird island?
Well, the bird islands were built because it's expensive to carry silt out of the lake. So you desilted and then you had only so much budget.
So you make a little hill.
Then you make a little hill in the center.
Okay.
So
but then that serves as a nesting site for certain types of birds and so on.
But there are also lakes which, like a ridiculously large portion of the lake is now a bird island because there was so much silt and there was just not enough budget to carry the silt out. Okay. So you can't do it forever, right? The first time you silt, you can do it.
And also having that bird island means fundamentally your volume in the lake will be much lesser, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not like you make it as a tower, but it will be as a mound, which means there's a lot of subsurface volume which is lost to that structure.
Yeah. And it's still not like got those shallow zones. It's still pretty much like
right.
a steep slope
And
at the side.
what does it mean for lake biology to have natural surface slopes and borders versus think Sankey tank, which is like it's a tank, right? Like you have these lined.
Yeah. And even in these bird islands, I mean, those slopes are not really natural. They're
Right.
not any kind of shallow form. Yeah, you're not going to have certain categories of bird species. You'll have, if you go to a lake like Jakur, you're going to see like the painted storks and the pelicans, because you have the large fish and you have the bird islands which have the large trees. But you're not going to find other types of wading birds that might require much more shallow zone and smaller fish.
So if we want to rejuvenate a lake, we should be thinking of all of this, right?
We should be thinking.
Or at least we should be thinking of what do we want this particular lake to, what functions this particular lake should have, and what can it possibly achieve, right?
Yeah.
If you have a horrendously polluted lake, even if you like desilt it, desludge it once, it may not be sufficient, right? I mean, people talk about multiple rejuvenations being needed before.
I mean, if you still have sewage coming into, you are going to eventually have degradation, and you're going to have to desludge every 10 years or so.
Right. So in the absence of the fundamental flows changing, all that we're thinking of is we are just rescuing things for a few years, right? And not creating any stable habitats or ecosystem.
This is a very artificial environment to start with. So we should not be expecting long-term ecological stability in the middle of a very dense city. So I think it's okay to be reconciled to having to desal, but the question is probably every 10 years, every 5 years is expensive. So probably every couple of decades is realistic.
Okay. So as we conclude this episode, what do you want people who are listening to this to walk away with? Is it that, hey, in a city where there's sewage still going into the lakes, the lake biology and chemistry, it's kind of hopeless? Is that the most realistic takeaway?
It's kind of it's firstly, I think one problem we have is that we don't even have agreement that we want the lakes to be ecological spaces. So if you look at, like, there was a whole controversy a few years ago between what was called the Karnataka Lake Development Authority and then the Tank Conservation Authority. And the uses of the words lakes and tank are very deliberate, because lake implies ecological zones as being, or ecological functions as being valued, while Tank Conservation Authority is basically, these are storage structures.
Water structures.
Their purpose is hydrology and flood control and that sort of thing. So firstly, even having a conversation around, we want to have ecology in these lakes, because if all you wanted to do was store water, you would want to make steep sides and deep depths, and you would not want to worry about, are there going to be wading birds in this place? Once you say that, no, these are multifunctional lakes and they are going to have flood control and groundwater recharge, and we care about the birds because they improve house prices, and children have nature deficit disorder, and they need to see these creatures like the painted storks and the pelicans. Then your conversation starts becoming, what can you do to at least manage the quality? And then you can kind of at least start looking at how polluted are they, what is the source apportionment, what measures can I take to mitigate, that sort of thing. So for me, the main thing is for us to first say these are the last remaining green spaces in the city, and we should be looking at their ecological functions as well as their hydrological functions. And secondly, maybe we can't get them to any kind of a pristine state, but we can, because there are these temporary flushes of fresh water coming in, we know that even though they have nutrients which are generally high because of legacy phosphates in the sediments and so on, but nonetheless for a large part of the year they do support life. And so what can we do to kind of enhance and manage that part of it? And then of course there's a whole bunch of other things you do to prevent the utterly stupid, which is a lot of lakes don't allow painted Ganeshas to be immersed in the main lake. You do it in the Kalyani off to the side. So we haven't talked about the really truly horrible parts of urban living, which is solid waste and plastic and those sorts of things.
Batteries and all kinds of
kinds of things. And so you at least remove all of those. So I feel while not aiming for something pristine, you can get to something that's acceptable, but at least by first acknowledging that that's important.
And I also want to say what you said about this idea of these lakes as these water structures versus, places of nature. There's also another point of, even for your water structure to serve that hydrological function, if you have sewage coming in and if you have these algal blooms and if you have that sludge, you're not going to get that groundwater recharge. If
Exactly.
you're using volume in the lake, you're not going to get flood control.
Exactly.
So you need to think about a little bit of chemistry and biology of the lakes, even if you don't care about the birds,
Yeah.
for the lakes to serve even those core water functions.
Yeah.
And then ideally, if you can pack in the nature part of it as well, because I mean, what other nature is left? It's not like we can go to a river in Bangalore.
Exactly.
We can't go to, a mountain within the city. There's no other place of nature. So we need at least birds we can find, and there might be some monkeys somewhere. I don't know.
I mean,
Right.
there's lots of other interesting green spaces around lakes. But,
Right.
one other thing is that the government and the real estate lobby, there have been these battles over the last years to continuously cut away at the buffer zone, right?
Right.
There was an entire debate that we had, which was to say, what role does the buffer zone play? And there were these, like, should it be 20 meters, should it be 50 meters, so on. The thing is that in order to have all of those birds and all of those other species, which are part of a larger food web, you do need to have green space around the lake. Now, because we haven't quantified it into a rule of thumb, the rule of thumb that 25 or 75 meters or whatever, we were never able to completely come up with an alternative number of what should we arrive at. It is playing an important function because you have nesting habitats and roosting habitats and so on and so forth. But how do you balance that off versus the sheer value of the land in real estate terms? And this is where we really kind of make the mistake of compartmentalizing and atomizing these arguments to a point where we no longer realize that the real estate values of cities and therefore the tax base go up when you have ecological spaces. Children are happier and therefore the happiness index, if we were to measure one, increases. You have a whole range of other benefits that you have. We look at the biology, and all of the discussion we've had is only the biology of the water and not of the entire land around it. I think it's a little reductionist. There's the story of Lorax and the trees, right? And then each tree is valuable until the last tree is cut, and then the entire economy and society collapses.
So we need to figure out how to have these conversations in realistic ways. And it's not about just developing a norm necessarily, right? Here's the reality. We've already encroached a bunch. How do we save what survives?
Yeah. It's missing the lake for the water, the analogy of missing the forest for the trees.
So on that note, thank you, Veena, for joining us on this episode. I'm hoping that we have other guests on the show as well. While you've studied hydrology extensively, is it fair to say that you're more a student of the chemistry and the biology of lakes?
Definitely. I have to say it's what I've learned from my former colleagues at ATRI. I know there are people who've studied, amphibian life, and there is excellent work by the fisheries department. There are other really good limnologists in the city, so we should bring all of those as well.
And so we should talk about the science of lakes, understand it better, and really talk about what does it mean to have a realistic solution, not in an ideal world, but just to make our current world one step better. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Well Labs show. Don't forget to subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Until next time.